6 o'clock. Where? Oh, yeah. There. Yeah.
Well,
Timetable.
a very warm welcome
That's what this enters.
to you all here, to LSE, and in particular, something called the Institute of Public Affairs. And I'm the director of it. My name appears there, Conor Gearty, and I'm particularly delighted to have an event which initiates what will be a theme at the Institute of Public Affairs over the course of the next couple of years, which is the theme of religion in public discourse. We're very lucky at LSE to have a director, Professor Craig Calhoun, who, though deeply immersed in the social sciences, is very interested in religion and the impact of religion on culture. And he, together with the Institute of Public Affairs, will be engaging in a dialogue, public discussion on religious themes through the next couple of years. And he starts that on, if I may start with the plug, on the 1st of December with Charles Taylor, in discussion with Charles Taylor. A number of you will be thinking, why do we have a war criminal commencing a discussion on religion? But you will have got the wrong Charles Taylor. Others of you will be thinking, what about the distinguished musician? What does he know about religion? You will have also got the wrong Charles Taylor. Those of you who thought, oh yes, the famous author of A Secular Age will have got the right Charles Taylor. So we are pleased about that. There's a number of other strands and so on. And this, in a way, therefore, marks the beginning of a commitment by LSE's IPA to things religious. And we're delighted that the chaplain, Father Jim Walters, has joined us as a senior fellow. But the event is not to celebrate IPA. It is, and I'm sure that the other sponsors, and we'll be hearing from Ed at the end, Ed Kessler from Woolf, will forgive me. It's partly to celebrate the 175th year of publication of a remarkable magazine. It's called The Tablet. There it is, The Tablet. It's a Catholic magazine, but it's a Catholic magazine with a strong, independent voice. And it might be thought by its, is it possible to describe them as enemies, Paul? Those with strongly different views about what a Catholic is. Critics would regard it as a liberal magazine. We who like it, and I've been a trustee for a number of years and also written for it, think of it as a place where you can get the whole story, for example, on the family synod at the moment in Rome, and the Pope's visit to America, the Pope of the Americas, but also is tremendous on culture, arts, books, and current affairs. A lovely read, and it's short enough for you to be able to finish the articles. That's a tremendous advantage. It does come every week. That's a bit trying. My Perfect magazine is once every 2 years. I have the energy to read it. So this is partly to celebrate the Tablet magazine. You can inspect it afterwards over drinks. I will be carrying it very prominently. The location of the drinks will not be revealed until later, but they are very close indeed. Now, we end this bit of the evening by 8 o'clock. And what we've decided to do for this fascinating theme, which carries with it a hashtag LSE Believer. Some of you, I would imagine, would know what that means. Others of you will wonder what on earth it is. This has nothing to do with you if you don't know what it is. But if you want to comment on Twitter about it, that's what you put. And the purpose of this evening is to explore a question. We were planning this, Tina, Paul, and I, some time ago. And the question is a simple one, at the extent to which it's still the case. I think we'll all accept that it has been the case. Is it still the case? And is it the same for all three? And what we thought we'd do is we'd bring together a community of speakers who come from different perspectives, but we're not tying them to present any kind of party line. First will be Frank here, in my immediate left, Cottrell-Boyce, screenwriter, novelist, wrote, among many other things, the Summer Olympics, a fantastic achievement, the opening ceremony. And Frank, would it be fair to say Frank represents sort of the Catholic tradition? And then you can express your view on that in a minute. I may have said the wrong thing. And then Sughra, who is immediately to Frank's left, program manager at the Woolf Institute, as I said. We're very grateful to them for supporting this, and more on them towards the end. The Centre for Policy and Public Education. And Sughra's been very interested in faith, belief, communities, and studies of first-generation Muslim women in Britain, and men, indeed, in the United Kingdom. And then we have Ruth, representing Jewish tradition from the University of Winchester, very interested in the representations of British Jewishness in contemporary literature and culture. So we've asked the three of them to think and talk for 10 minutes or so on this question. And then, in a little twist, before you get your own say, but you will get your own say, the timing will be tight, we have three students. I'll introduce them when we get to them. Three students from LSE who've bravely volunteered to comment on what they've heard from the three traditions. So we have an echo from the student body of what we've heard, and they'll be addressing the question. So we have generational universality. I'm going to be quite a tough taskmaster in regards to time, and not least because I do myself speak too much and leave no room for anybody else. But we're going to ask you, Frank, to begin at 19 minutes to 7 on the Catholic perspective, if that's what it is, the Book and the Believer, are Catholics, Jews and Muslims still outsiders in British society? Frank.
Okay. So, hi, I am the right Frank Cottrell-Boyce, not the wrong one. And the question is, are we still outsiders? And it would be completely absurd in a lot of ways to consider myself an outsider. I've written Coronation Street, Doctor Who, I wrote the Olympics opening ceremony, I've written sequels to Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Basically, I've been allowed to play with the crown jewels of British culture for all my career. And I've, you know, a lot of people said I've had some influence on how you define British culture. But I did grow up in a very, very separatist Catholic environment, Catholic/Irish. The definition of Catholicism was very much Irish. Our priests were Irish. The social life was Irish. We learnt songs about St. Patrick. We never learnt songs about St. George or St. Andrew or St. David. Ceilidhs were the kind of how people socialised. And it was a separatism that was, this is for my parents' generation, and I sort of saw the tail end of it because I grew up I lived in my grandma's house, that this was a separatism that was created and was policed when Catholic children were evacuated during the war. The clergy went to great lengths to make sure that they were evacuated to Catholic areas. My father wasn't, and a vicar came to the house and asked him just a very kind of ordinary question, asked him what his name was, and my dad stood up as a little boy and went, "I am a Roman Catholic," and left the room. And so how has it happened that I've kind of like that was sort of culturally the background, and that we've kind of moved on from that? And I want to pick out one person. From long before I was born, there was a priest in Liverpool called Father Nugent. And I think what Father Nugent did is really salient to what's happening now. Father Nugent was born in the 1820s, and in 1849, the worst year of the Irish famine, Liverpool was completely, to use Cameronian language, swamped by refugees from the Irish famine. Well, not refugees from the Irish famine, because the people who would have been refugees from the Irish famine just dropped dead. These were economic migrants. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. I haven't got the figures to hand, but more people from Ireland came into Liverpool in those few years than the population of Liverpool. Liverpool became effectively a refugee camp. And this terribly English priest, Father Nugent, who trained at Ushaw, began a thing called the Catholic Institute. He began a rescue mission to particularly to boys. These were migrants that had every reason to hate the host nation. The famine was a politically created thing, being created by the English. They'd come here for shelter. So it was a very kind of hostile environment, and he began this school, the Catholic Institute, which is now St. Edward's College. And first of all, I just want to celebrate what an amazing response that is. But also, I've just read Paul Valéry's piece about the history of Catholic identity in Britain, and you talk very specifically about Catholic schools and what they did, and faith schools and what faith schools do, and they allow a faith to detach itself from its cultural identity, which in my case would be an Irish cultural identity, and to be a living thing and to move people on. And you make the point, Paul made the point that people like the 7-7 bombers did not go to faith schools. And there's a sort of separation there between identity and a faith, which is a living, growing thing and which moves you on. And I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to inherit what people like James Nugent did and create a kind of living intellectual tradition around my faith, which allowed populations to move on from faith as a kind of cultural identity So, for instance, the school that my children went to, St. Edward's College, a fantastically successful college school, which was a faith school, and did a fantastic. Its mission was to create a Catholic middle class, and it did effectively create a middle class in a city that didn't really have a middle class that was drawn from an Irish Catholic background. It did create those people. You could argue that it didn't do a great job of propagating the faith. It made a lot of young Catholic men into solicitors or teachers or doctors or whatever. It didn't, proportionally, it didn't make a lot of them into Catholics. And one of the things that's sort of striking to me about being a Catholic in Britain is that the cultural reach of Catholicism massively outreaches the reality of being a Catholic. And that's partly because of that. The one big thing that you live with as a Catholic now is that you're living in the shadow of Vatican II. There's this huge, huge rift in Catholic culture, pre-Vatican II Catholic culture, post-Vatican II Catholic culture. And that a lot of the images of Catholicism are created by people who are very, very successful from those Catholic schools and went into the media and created these images, but they're images of nostalgia from their own childhood. So you're constantly having to kind of explain yourself in relation to a very outmoded view of Catholicism. As someone who worked in the media, that was something that was hitting me all the time, that if I talked about Catholicism, people immediately saw it as a kind of dressy up, Sound of Music, Wimples, smells, bells, things. And it was very difficult to explain that you had something, that what you had was a very different world view. So, for instance, working in film is an incredibly conservative, conventional thing. And I worked on a film called Millions, which is about a little boy who saw saints. And to me, this was a great solution. This is a great thing. This is a great ability to have. If I lose my car keys, I pray to St. Anthony. The idea that St. Anthony might be visible in the room, patting his pockets down, saying, "Where did you last have them?" seemed like a really kind of good thing to me. But when you had meetings with your backers, they would say things like, "This is just very interesting, and of course he has to move on from this position. How is he going to get closure on this, what is regarded as a psychosis?" I also worked on a film about St. Paul for a while, where I had a meeting where somebody said to me, that conversion scene, that comes out of the blue, you really need to set that up. Which, like, the whole point of St. Paul is that it literally comes out of the blue. And so it's quite sometimes difficult to explain that you live in a different reality, that you have a different set of values, without that being a kind of fortified, separate, visible identity marked by different customs or different clothing. And therefore, one of the things, I mean, so if I say to people I'm a Catholic, people automatically assume I'm a lapsed Catholic. And I have to explain that, no, I turn up for practice every Sunday and more. And therefore you have to out yourself as a Catholic, and people will try to stop you outing yourself as a Catholic. I wrote an article for The Guardian recently about British values, in which I said my values came from my parents, from punk rock and from the church. And they changed it to his values came from punk rock and from his parents and from Blue Peter, which I don't think I even mentioned. It's like, thank you. But I feel completely equal to kind of expressing and so you kind of have to out yourself. And for me, like, one of the big test moments was that I got asked to host the papal visit to Hyde Park, which was not the Pope that everybody loves now, but Pope Benedict, which people felt very ambiguous about. And in the build-up to that, I did feel the press was so negative about it that I did feel I was really kind of outing myself in a big way by turning up to this. And I did genuinely think there was only going to be me and Pope Benedict and a packet of hobnobs in Hyde Park, because it was such a kind of negative thing. And then, of course, I got there, and this whole invisible London, you discover that the press is not the national conversation, and that this amazingly diverse in terms of age and race and class and ability and every kind of, representative of every possibility of being a human was in that park. And that was kind of an amazing thing for me. And so you have to kind of out yourself and carry your values forward. I want to talk about something completely different, like this is sort of coming from not within my Catholic tradition. Am I all right for time?
You're all right for time. You have 2 minutes and 15 seconds.
Okay, 2 minutes and 15 seconds. I go on holiday a lot of times to a place in the Dumfries and Galloway called Ruthwell. And it's a tiny village. And the vicar of Ruthwell, back at the time that Father Nugent was starting this amazing mission, was this kind of man that the Anglican, Scottish Church of Scotland clergy sort of threw up, a gentleman amateur of amazing accomplishments. His name was Dr. Duncan, and he saw that his parishioners were poor, and he started a savings bank. It's the first savings bank in the world. It became the Trustees Savings Bank, an amazing thing. He also discovered one of the very first complete dinosaur skeletons, and he had an intellectual from Oxford come up and talk to the workmen who'd found this skeleton about what it was and what it could be. And it's an amazing kind of tiny rural village Renaissance figure. And one of the things he did with his archaeological prodding about was he found this thing, with this beautiful cross that had been destroyed during the Reformation. It's called the Ruthwell Cross now, and it's one of the great masterpieces of Europe in the 8th century. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And everything in Dr. Duncan would have regarded that as idolatry, I think. He eventually left the Church of Scotland and became a member of one of the Wee Frees. He was quite an extreme Protestant. But he saw this thing and he knew it was a beautiful thing. And he put it up in his church. And the cross is this marvellous thing. And it's got a poem on it. It's got a poem called The Dream of the Rood, which is one of the great Anglo-Saxon poems. And it's written not in English letters, but in runes. So it was written by somebody from a Viking background. Like it's across so many barriers from where he was, and he put it up. And I want to read you just a few lines from The Dream of the Rood. The Dream of the Rood is the cross speaking. And the cross says, I have on earth not many noble friends, but they have gone hence from earth joys and sought the King of glory. With the High Father now they live in heaven and dwell in glory. And I wait for when the cross of God, which here on earth I formerly beheld, may fetch me from this transitory life and carry me to where there is great bliss and joy, where the Lord's host is seated at the feast, and it shall set me where I afterwards may dwell in lasting bliss. All of Anglo-Saxon poetry is about this. It is about the passingness of life. And in the end, I kind of think, am I an outsider? Am I an insider? It doesn't really matter, because you shouldn't, as a Catholic, I shouldn't judge myself by whether the world thinks I have a legitimate voice or not, where I belong or not, because in the end, I don't belong on the earth. And the only thing that matters, that I should judge myself whether I'm inside or outside, is the cross. And that's what James Nugent did. He didn't think about whether this is going to go down well, me helping all these refugees. It is actually what Dr. Henry Duncan did. He just knew this was a beautiful thing that should be witnessed. And so that is where, I think I'm running out of time, aren't I? So I would end with The Dream of the Rood and say, of course I'm an outsider, because I don't belong in this world. I have another home somewhere else.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Frank. Now, the reason we're being speedy with the speech is to give more space for discussion afterwards, so it won't be that last word from Frank at all. We know we're outsiders in Guardian culture, if not British culture. But Blue Peter is to the Guardian a kind of religion, I suppose. So Sughra, over to you for your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Conor. My name is Sughra Ahmed, and I work at the Woolf Institute in Cambridge. I am also chair of an organisation called the Islamic Society of Britain. I am going to talk to you for a few minutes about British Muslims, the demographics, so we get a sense of who we're talking about here, what we're discussing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the insider-outsider phenomenon that is drawn up in the question. So, because we're short on time, I'm not going to stand here and ask how many Muslims do you think there are in Britain. Instead, I'm going to tell you that there are 2.79 million Muslims living across Britain today. That's less than 5% of the British population. Most Muslims, historically, hail from the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, Bangladesh, places like that. And although the mix of Muslims is extremely diverse, they come from different parts of the world and importantly from right here within the UK itself. When we think about the migration of Muslim communities into Britain, often we think about the 1950s, the 1960s, where we saw the initial stages of economic migration come from the subcontinent. I won't go into the details as to why that occurred. Those of you who are interested can easily look that up. But essentially, legislative changes in the 1960s meant that many Pakistani, Indian and Bangladeshi Muslims who were first generation had to make a choice and call their families over. And so that's when we saw significant proportions of British Muslims now, but once hailing from the Indian subcontinent. Today, we're around 4th and 5th generation in that population. And so we're talking about, when we talk about young British Muslims, we're talking about people who are clearly born and raised in Britain, but also know nothing else. Know Britain only as their home and are very much at ease with that. I guess there's also been a long-standing history of British Muslims in this country, long before the 1950s. So if you think about some of the pictures and artifacts that are available, it gives you a very strong impression of a very early, possibly convert community, we think, that was here in the British Isles. And things like the Ballycotton Cross, the King Offer coins are strong indications of engagement with Muslim societies, if not Islam, right here in Britain. With the current population of British Muslims, around half of them are born and raised in the UK, as I said. But the scene has become much more complex recently, over the last 5 to 10 years, with migration into the UK, migration out of the UK. The British Muslim scene has become much more diverse. But something really interesting when I was looking into this subject in my early days, something that I found really fascinating is that we now have more Muslims living as minorities across the world than ever before. So if we think about Muslim communities globally, more Muslims actually lived in majority contexts until things like globalization took effect, and now most Muslims actually live in a minority context, which means that when we're having internal conversations within the British Muslim communities, for example, we're talking about time and place and context that hasn't really been taken into consideration when we're trying to grapple with and understand the place of Muslims in this world. So if you're living in a majority context, actually the way you understand and you see the world is very, very different to when you're in a minority context. And so it's really, really interesting over the last 60, 70 years to see particularly Western Muslims, so European, American, Canadian, and so on, try to sort of grow up with a very different understanding of their faith and their place than their parents and their grandparents. Now, there are lots of different challenges that any community faces, and when we talk about British Muslims, there are both internal community challenges and external. The internal are things like equality, gender dynamics, community leadership, and something called minority fiqh, minority jurisprudence. And so this is really important for me. I think this is something that's going to be quite telling in the future. Already we are seeing leading British Muslims, scholarly British Muslims, trying to understand minority context jurisprudence. So, you know, when we have a situation in, let's say, for example, Malaysia, there's one way of dealing with that situation. But actually, if we have a similar scenario right here in Britain, do we deal with that in exactly the same way? Or is it important to think about the time, the context, the place that we're in, and use that as part of our understanding in how to deal with that scenario? The external challenges are things like educational underachievement. This is quite a significant problem in the British Muslim community. Although at the same time, for those British Muslims who are at university, almost half of them are women, 43%. But when it comes to secondary school educational achievement, Pakistani and Bangladeshi boys don't do especially well. This disproportionately affects the Muslim community because it has a very high youth population. Over half of British Muslims, 54%, are aged under 19, well, 19 and under. So any kind of policies, any kind of issues that impact on young people particularly, then are exaggerated within the Muslim community. Now, when we talk about insiders and outsiders, well, I did a small project that Conor mentioned earlier, Generation 1.0. This project a few years ago basically recorded the stories of first-generation Muslims who migrated to the UK, and were the first in their family to migrate. That was really important. So they came on their own. And when I went all around the country talking to people from all the way from Scotland down to London, you don't hear that generation complain. But I was trying to get to the meat of how they felt when they first came to these shores, when they first realized how cold it was, and when they first realized that actually they're all by themselves. How did they deal with that? How did they feel about that? And they had often nothing but praise for the fact that they were warmly welcomed by their neighbours. Say, for example, if they worked in a corner shop, I know it's very typical scenario, but if they worked in a corner shop, they were treated well by the customers and so on. And so they underplayed a lot of what we know as racism and prejudice that existed during that time. And their memories are really important because they're indicative of something. They're telling us something. But what are the indicators for being on the inside? Is it food? Is it the fact that we eat the same food or similar foods? Drink? Clothing? Is it language? Is it generational settlement? So is it the fact that, generation after generation, people look and sound and feel much more settled? Is it identity? So is it something like the Tebbit test? Which cricket team would you support if England and one other were playing? Which is a really interesting question right now with the cricket. Or is it identity? However we might understand that. And survey after survey, both in Britain and across Europe, has told us time and time again that British Muslims especially, compared to their European counterparts, identify with Britain far more than any other group in this country. Which I find fascinating because I don't necessarily hear that in the public sort of discourse of British Muslims. So, excuse me. So whatever it is that makes you an insider or an outsider, when a community has gone through generational shifts, so from first to fifth generation now, a community has taken ownership of its space, has taken rights but also honoured its responsibilities. For me, a really strong indication of being on the inside or the outside is when communities start to mark, celebrate, speak publicly, not only about achievements, but also about their culture, arts, music, and they speak about those things in a very confident with a very confident voice that gives you an indication that this community is rooted in Britain. It has long and deep roots in Britain, and that it feels very confident about that and very proud of that. Some examples that I'd like to share of that presence, if you like. The first is something called the Living Islam Festival. I don't know how many people here have come across the Living Islam Festival. It's something that's been taking place for the last 11 years or so. It takes place every couple of years, and it's basically a huge festival like any other British festival. It takes place in a showground in Lincolnshire. Is run by the Islamic Society of Britain and basically draws together thousands and thousands of British Muslims from across the country who come as families and, believe it or not, live in a tent, camp for a very long weekend. Sometimes it's wet because it's Britain. Sometimes it's not so wet. But whatever the weather conditions, they have fun, they learn, their kids run around, there's music, it's a festival like any other festival. And it's a celebration of being British Muslims. Another example is an Eid celebration that has started in recent years in Trafalgar Square. Again, I don't know how many people have actually come across this or attended. We're in the heart of London, so I imagine some people will have come across this. But Trafalgar Square for Eid is absolutely packed, heaving, with British Muslims celebrating and marking Eid every year. And it's a very public way of saying that we are happy, we are proud, we are confident, and we want you to join in our celebrations in this very public space, in this shared space. And finally, on this, I just want to talk about another sign of confidence, and that is when a community starts to give back, as it were. And all of us at some stage in our life will think about what we can give back to society because society sort of invested in us. Well, when it comes to issues around poverty, homelessness, and other very desperate situations that have only worsened over the last few years, there are charities and projects like Made in Europe that deals with climate change specifically, Eat and Meet, which deals with homelessness and refugee and asylum seekers specifically. And these are all people who have got together as volunteers often to make a positive contribution to the complicated fabric of our society. So these vibrant cultures are no longer South Asian, they are no longer Arab, Middle Eastern, etc., as they may have been for the first generation. Instead, they are British and belong right here in Britain. In fact, they don't fit anywhere else in the world. So if you took British Muslims and a group of British Muslims that have a heritage in India and took them to India, it would be an alien concept for them, etc., etc. So I know my time is up. There's lots of time for questions. So I look forward to talking with you more then. Thank you.
And of course, there's the reception afterwards, where our guests will also be present for a little while at least. Ruth.
Right. Below that. Okay, can you hear me? 'Cause, yeah, is that better? Yeah. So when I got this invitation from Conor, a very engaging email was sent that kind of drew us all in, and I partly wondered if it was a joke, because I thought, well, you know, a Catholic, a Muslim, and a Jew all going to a lecture theatre. Actually, now I'm here, it doesn't seem funny at all. And then the realisation that somehow I might have been asked to represent, you know, the Jew, and I don't in any way sort of feel that I can stand here and speak for Jews or Judaism either. So I'm speaking from my own perspective, which is secular, really, interested but somewhat disconnected from Jewishness. And I'm also speaking as an academic who's worked on these matters. So I work on literary studies. So my interest is in the kind of stories and representation. So I don't get out much, I sort of read and think about things. And what I've done over the last few years is I did write a book about British Jewish writing, and the experience of writing that book was quite revealing for me, because it was obvious that, in a way, that the project somehow kind of stemmed from me really trying to work out something about myself. They usually do these projects. And my own relationship to my Jewishness. So my own feeling of being somehow kind of both inside and outside of Jewishness, and simultaneously both outside and inside of Britishness. So like many others, my demographic, my root here is very typical. So I was born into a British Jewish family with grandparents from Russia, Poland, those regions. And it's a very typical story of the immigrant settlement of Jews from the East End of London to outer London suburbs, in my case, Ilford in Essex. And now I find myself, I work at the university in Winchester, which is a very different environment, a cathedral city in southern England, very different. And I actually, because none of us that actually work at the university can afford to live in Winchester, I live miles away in Dorset. And again, it's an incredibly different environment to the one that I grew up in. It really is. It fascinates me. It's a novelty every day. I've lived there for 13, 14 years, but it's, you know, it's sheep, it's rolling hills, it really is kind of WI markets and local families that have roots that are really deeply embedded in that Dorset soil. And so there's a church at the end of my road, and you go to that churchyard and you see names of families that have been there for generations. My children went to the C of E school at the end of the road by the church. So this is all a long way from the world of my grandparents. People who were very integral integrated into this country, but always made a distinction between what they called the English and us, the Jews, as if somehow you couldn't be both. And so what I'm seeing now in my kind of thinking of my observations and my work is that there are increasingly more diverse ways of connecting to Jewishness. Some of it's religious, but I can't really speak for that because this isn't sort of the world that I know particularly well. So a lot of it's about culture, about identity, about belonging and not belonging. And when I was working on my book, two things in particular came out of that research. I was mostly looking at fiction, contemporary fiction from 1990 onwards, and some memoirs and journalism too. And the two things I noticed, firstly, was that there was a shift. There was a shift from the preoccupying concerns of different generations of British Jews. So to just vastly oversimplify, bluntly, you might say that Jews of my parents' and grandparents' generation were often very anxious about how to be British, how to fit in. And now what I'm seeing in more recent writing by younger generations of Jews is a different emphasis, a different anxiety. And the anxiety now is sometimes about how to be Jewish. It's not about how to be British, it's how to connect with a sense of heritage. And connected to that, there's a kind of romance associated with not belonging that comes up in a lot of this writing and reflection, a kind of nostalgia for what sometimes seems like a more meaningful connection to otherness, for want of a better word. So in some of this writing, you can get a feel that actually sometimes assimilation can be a bit bland, a bit boring. And I also found that in the end, many British Jewish writers today, well, the kinds that I was reading, because obviously it's a self-selecting process, were interested in, funny enough, just what I was interested in when I started. So that's what I found. Provisional, multiple, overlapping kind of identities. And British Jewishness has always been, you know, as the term goes, hyphenated. And now it seems like a lot more. The possibilities are diffuse and diverse. Jonathan Miller once described himself as Jewish, with the hyphen in the middle. And ever since he said that, he's been asked to explain it. So he never really has, but others have taken on that mantle. And he also added to that he might as well say he was British, because neither identity contained him. They were both as kind of meaningful and meaningless. So I've kind of run with that quite a lot. And I've got a chapter that goes into the Jewish-ishness, and so it goes on. And this isn't to deny that there are, of course, real differences, real difficulties and anxieties amongst some British Jews, many. A lot of concerns about diminishing identities as Jews increasingly kind of intermarry, form reconfigured sort of families. And there's an anxiety that an increasingly diluted form of Jewishness might just become eventually a homeopathic trace of identity, and there will be nothing left, nothing distinct. There's a lot of anxiety in certain quarters of Anglo-Jewish public speaking about diminishing numbers. It's less than 300,000 now. And of course, it's a very complex history of attitudes towards Jews in this country. There is a history of anti-Semitism. It's a particularly sort of subtle, understated often anti-Semitism. The famous quote from Conor Cruise O'Brien about anti-Semitism was that it's a light sleeper. So it can wake suddenly from time to time. And it's a really complex issue, and I don't know if I'm out of time.
No, you're not out of time.
Right.
You've got a whole
I might finish
2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes,
But
right.
you can give them up if you want.
No, I just feel that I can't stand here and sort of not acknowledge that the situation in Israel-Palestine clearly affects how Jews are treated in this country and has caused much concern, debates and divisions, you know, within the Anglo-Jewish population and beyond. So I can't ignore that. So are Catholics, Jews and Muslims still outsiders? I mean, I think for Jews, in any case, the answer really is no and yes. When I finished my book, I have to say that I felt rather optimistic. And I think that's just the nature of that sort of project, you know, kind of euphoria to end it. But it did seem to me at the end that in contemporary Britain, Jewishness was just one difference amongst many. And that's not to say that all differences are equal or equivalent. I mean, this evening testifies to that already. But there was something that's, you know, continuously evolving about Jewishness in lots of ways. And that's where I was left with the book and the work that I'd done. And there was just, to end anecdotally, there was a family occasion, and I certainly don't want to sort of stand here and glorify my own family, but I remember just looking round, and I saw all sorts of complex identities, affiliations within this family gathering. Believers, non-believers, practicing, non-practicing, Hindus, Christians, converts, gay couples with children of mixed heritage. And I thought, yeah, all this kind of reading about it, writing, thinking about it, here it is. There is something enduring about this kind of Jewishness. It's a Jewishness in process, and it's enduring because it's adaptable, it's flexible, it's fluid. And in that way, it seems very British.
Very nice way to end there. I'm sure I won't be alone in observing how much connectivity there is between our three, as it were, community outsiders. Very interesting how some common themes emerged. Now, what we're going to do now, as I said earlier on, is slightly unusual, and we're going to give our students 5 minutes to speak to us. We need to be extremely appreciative of their bravery in stepping into the breach. And as they walk up, I'll introduce them. The first off, to kick off, is Rob. Rob? Yeah, why not? Go on, why not? I was going to do the mastermind thing and say who he is as he walks up. His name is Rob Slynn. He's doing a master's here at Tennessee, International Development and Humanitarian Emergency. I could get you all to try and guess which religion it is that he broadly shadows, but I think that'd be a bit mean, a bit unfair. He's, in fact, coming from Roman Catholic faith, and he's going to provide his thoughts on what he's been hearing. Rob, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Conor, and thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak. Similarly to Dr. Ruth, I feel I have to start off by saying a big task to represent, over 1 billion people, or in this case, quite a few million British Catholics as well. A group, British Catholics anyway, that sometimes I have huge differences with as well, vast multitude of views within that. What can I offer then to this question, though? Well, I can offer an individual, a young person growing up in the British society, what I experienced, some of the easy parts of growing up as a Catholic here, and some of the more difficult parts, the things that made me feel slightly more of an outsider. By no means, in my humble opinion, I feel Catholics are huge outsiders here. Certainly when you consider some of the more pressures and difficulties that some other religious groups have in British society. I feel Catholics are part of Britain. I love my history. Whilst Catholics are sometimes portrayed as the baddies in British history, certainly Catholics are intertwined with so many key British events. And in that sense, I would argue that they're not outsiders, they're a key part of the British story. But in certain respects, growing up, I did feel a bit of an outsider. There were tensions, often felt uncomfortable. In childhood, certainly being a Catholic wasn't a cool thing. Certainly many of the teachings of the church are criticised or seem to be too strict to young people. I learnt from an early age to try and keep my faith to myself and to not be so open about introducing myself as a Catholic. In my adult life, I still feel, to a certain extent, that I face judgments when I mention that I'm a Catholic. I'm very easily pigeonholed. I think people just judge straight away, if you're a Catholic, one must hold certain views. Again, as I say, despite the Catholic Church being such a broad church, a huge group of people. My first job, I worked at an NGO, and it was an NGO that was focusing on things like fair trade, on environmental rights. Whenever talking about issues like HIV/AIDS, about LGBT rights, these would obviously be things which my colleagues would be anticipating that I would say something that they could latch onto and argue with me about. Certainly, I felt that people felt it was inconsistent that I should work for such an organisation despite being Catholic. My friends would say, Rob's a Catholic, but he's okay. And I think that sums up a lot of people's views on this. An undergraduate perspective, when I was at university, I almost felt a bit of an outsider with the Christian community as well. In my undergraduate days, the Christian Union in my university was very active and vocal. Many of the Christian Union supporters were pretty anti-Catholic, and certainly in their vocabulary, they wouldn't describe Catholics as Christian. That's another interesting dynamic growing up as a Catholic here. I had the privilege of spending some time working overseas, and this was really interesting for me to contrast my experience in Britain with working in a developing country, in this case, Mongolia. Certainly, people's questions about faith, they'd be surprised if you had no faith, not that you had one. And this was a huge, interesting change for me to come back to Britain with. And in that sense, yes, maybe having a faith, maybe being a Catholic, does make you slightly an outsider, certainly compared to some other countries. But equally, I saw in the case of Mongolia, Catholicism was an exciting young religion, new, a challenge to Buddhism, whereas often, certainly in my youth, Buddhism was the cool, interesting religion. So that was equally something interesting to reflect on. Final thing I just wanted to say about my experiences, as a postgraduate here at the LSE, and I'll choose my words carefully, but even here in this fantastic institution, in seminar discussions, people can make great generalizations about Catholics and Catholicism. And in that sense, again, it does feel like you're a bit of an outsider, you're being judged, and that people are not taking the time to truly understand what you're about. In conclusion, I'd just like to say, I think it's an interesting paradox. British people, I feel they know a lot about Catholicism, and so feel more comfortable to criticize it than some other faiths. They're less guarded with their comments. In many ways, I would argue that that's proof that we are insiders in some ways, because they feel that they know enough about it, that they're not scared to criticize. I'll leave that as a question for further discussion. Maybe some of you agree or disagree with that. But thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much, Rob. Second of our three, and then into the general discussion. Obai Afifi, undergraduate, second year government and economics here at LSE, government and economics. And he's going to reflect on the question from a Muslim perspective.
Thank you, Professor. Hi, everyone. My name is Obai. I am the president of the Islamic Society here. So listening to what some of the other speakers said, I thought I'd offer an insight from a student perspective as to life at university, and hopefully try to give some insight into the question of whether or not we are outsiders. So I'd like to pick up on something Sughra said, and that's about the generational shifts. So it's particularly relevant with regards to students because it shows the dynamics of the minority treatment across different generations. So at universities in particular, Muslim students, I wouldn't say they're not only insiders, but they're an integral part of the fabric that makes up the communities in all of the universities across the UK. So they do lots of amazing work, be it within their own communities or outside of that. And our Islamic Society, thankfully last year we actually won Society of the Year, without gloating too much.
Stop boasting.
And there is a reason for that. Muslims in Britain, we have, and at universities in particular, we have an amazing ability to mobilize and to campaign. And there's a very strong sense of cohesion within our societies. The result of that, I believe, is that we're not isolated, as some people like to believe. We don't always keep ourselves to ourselves. We interact with people of other races, faiths. We campaign, and we're very active members of the society that we're a part of, the wider society. And we do, being Brits, being Muslims, we want to benefit, we want to work to improve the society that we live and work in. There is, however, an alternative side to this narrative. There is, in the current climate, a political current that, from the outside at least, is making some Muslim students, or a large number of Muslim students, begin to feel like they're outsiders. So without, obviously there is a growing Islamophobic climate. So because of that, many feel that they're under scrutiny and they're constantly questioned about their identity, about their faith, about their allegiance. And a lot of the scrutiny is not necessarily based in direct discrimination or malice, but a lot of it can be in fear. And that's where it's particularly concerning for us, because fear is a natural human response. So for other people to fear it just because of who we are can make you feel a little bit isolated, or like an outsider per se. And this sort of culminated in what most university students will be aware of in the PREVENT strategy, or the counter-terrorism laws that were passed after recent events. So I'm sure most of you are aware, universities and institutions now have a legal duty to look out for signs of radicalization within their attendees. And whilst the LSE has been particularly minimalist in its interpretation of these laws, the premise of monitoring your students or being suspicious of them just because of their faith is particularly problematic. And there are wider repercussions in terms of intellectual freedoms as students. So many students now, I'm a government student, in many of our classes we'll be discussing contentious topics and current affairs. And some students can be scared to say what they really feel. They can be scared to discuss the topic in depth or give their real opinion for fear of being on the radar or monitored by their teacher. They don't want to say something wrong. And that is problematic, because if there's one thing that I've learned sort of living and growing up in Britain, is that you need to cultivate knowledge, and you need to go out and seek to be an active member of your society. And that involves challenging the status quo, and that involves questioning authority. And that, for me, is a British value, if, to use an ambiguous term in the current climate. So overall, I'd say on a wider scale, Britain is becoming more tolerant because we now have a wave of educated second, third, fourth generation immigrants that are born and raised in this country. And they're very active citizens as Muslims, and they're very much insiders. If you ask them, they'd say they were British. They know nothing else, just like Sughra said. But you also can't ignore the growing suspicion and demonization of Muslims, especially students. And these have quite far-reaching consequences in terms of our cohesion and our trust of each other as Brits in this society. Thank you very much.
Very powerful, Obai. Thank you very much. I probably should say we've seen nothing yet. There's plans for a government extremism bill, which will be landed on us without consultation anytime between now and February, which will escalate what you've been talking about. and expect that to be what preoccupies us advocates of free speech and so on in the coming months. Lastly, 5 minutes of opportunity. Gabby Schnoyer, I'm very pleased to welcome a law student, law and anthropology. I'm a law prof, second year, and Gabby is going to reflect on the perspective from a kind of Jewish. I'm a bit nervous about that, Ruth, having said it's not entirely a Jewish perspective. Jewish-ish.
Okay, no problem.
Gabby,
so
5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to be speaking from a slightly different perspective from Ruth. I've been brought up as an Orthodox Jew. I'm observant, and I come from a very kind of Jewish part of northwest London, so I'm very much involved in the community. So when asked to speak about whether, as a Jewish student, I felt as an outsider in society, my initial response was, absolutely not. I've always felt proud of being British. I love tea and scones, celebrated all the royal weddings, feel very kind of like happy to fly the British flag in every sense. Yet, at the same time, the title of the talk didn't really kind of confound me, nor did I find it surprising that such questions were being asked. I remember one of my earliest confrontations with the issue of Jewish identity. It took place on a Saturday afternoon lunch with my grandma. So my brother was discussing how an argument had taken place between him and some friends at the Sunday Football League, between his team and another team. So he was in a fully Jewish team playing against a secular team, and they'd gotten into some kind of argument, not physical, just kind of bad words being thrown about. And when my grandma heard this story, she was very angered by it, and she didn't hold back her opinion. She said, "That's not right, we're guests in this country." Similar, I guess, to what Ruth's grandma had said as well. And this had in turn provoked a very frustrated response from the other members of my family. We said, "We're not guests in this country, we were born in England, we were raised here." And my grandma herself, even though her family had they'd been refugees and they'd come from the war, she herself had been born and raised in Hendon, northwest London. So, perhaps that wasn't the idea of an outsider can be seen as something, an understanding limited to the older generation, something that maybe young people now, someone like me, I feel potentially more British than my grandparents may do. But arriving at university, I did feel that my Jewish identity was quizzed further. So I've been raised as Orthodox Jewish, and I do believe wholeheartedly in many of the values that the Torah teaches. But if I chose to, I could don no overt signs of my religion. I need not cover my head with a kippah, as the Torah asks of Orthodox males. And my family had encouraged me to interpret modesty in the way I saw fit. So when it came to dress sense, there was nothing that really kind of marked me out and made me look different from other people. So keeping kosher, observing the Sabbath, and the way I would interact with other people would kind of dictate the extent to which I would let my religion kind of shape my identity, and it very much became how much I wanted to engage myself, and I felt it was a very personal choice. Speaking to friends at university, for some, I was the first Jewish person they'd met, which was a bit weird. Here at the LSE, I must say that I've never felt as an outsider. And the diverse mix of people that we have from all across the world really just makes me think that there isn't kind of a standard person, and that everyone comes from across the world with their own story and their own background. So here, I guess, I've never felt on the outside. But I will say that I am very much aware of the limitations of my experience. London itself has a hugely diverse population, similar to the LSE, and of course it also has the largest Jewish population in the UK is also in London. So perhaps had I been the only Jew in the village somewhere in the countryside, I would be standing here saying something very different. Yet, even here in London, it's true that I have experienced anti-Semitism from the more unfortunate extreme events of hearing friends assaulted because they were walking down the street wearing a Star of David or a kippah. Or even just to a milder form, walking with my brother to synagogue one day and someone shouts out, "pancake head," things like that, that aren't necessary, that just make you feel a bit uncomfortable. So do I feel like an outsider? For me, I'm going to put the answer as no, but I will nonetheless posit that I'm glad that this question is being asked, and I do think it's an important one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabby. That was I must say it's very nice to hear that remark about LSE. I think we're delighted to see Father Jim here, the Anglican chaplain's here, and he may want to add to this, but he led an event in Israel, visited many Jewish homes, and we have 3 times as many Jewish students here, I think, than the university average. So pretty good, pretty good. We have got, because of the discipline of our fantastic speakers, and a fantastically disciplined student bunch as well, we have some time. We have about 25 minutes or so. We're not going to keep you here after 8 o'clock, and Ed will want to say a few words just before 8 from Woolf. So in deference to our speakers and those around you, I think you should try and be as succinct as you can be. And despite the religious theme, do not give in to the temptation to sermonize. So we might take 2 or 3 in a row and see how many we can have. There are stewards dressed in provocatively socialist LSE red, and they will come to you if you catch my eye. And you will say who you are, hopefully, and also whether you are LSE, and you will ask your succinct question. Do we have any volunteers to set an excellent good practice? We have this gentleman here, we have that gentleman. We take this gentleman first at the back, and then we have this. Now, I'm not going to take 3 men in a row. I'm going to be totally explicit in my search for variety. We've got a lady here, so we'll go 1, 2, 3, and then we will come back to you, sir, on the next wave, okay? Sir.
A quick question. My name's Matthew. I used to be an Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and I became an Anglo-Saxon Catholic about 18 years ago. And this taught me the discipline of us all being children of God. The Catholic Church has clear understanding about deep appreciation of the Jewish and Muslim faiths. So the question is, which you prefer, multiculturalism or the society?
Thank you, Matthew. So that's aimed at all 3, not any particular speaker. Thank you. Madam in the front row here.
I'm Fahia Osman. I'm from...
Sorry, what's your first name?
Fahia.
Fahia.
I'm a 6th former from Harris